In the afternoon on Christmas Day, everybody in Dog River was gathered at the community hall as they did every Christmas Day. They sat around a pot-bellied stove enjoying one another's company, telling stories, drinking tea, playing cards and checkers, and visiting, and listening to Christmas carols and Boxcar Willie on Lester McNeil's battery-powered record player. Granny McNeil had told the story about Jody McNeil and the moose they called Brian Mulrooney, and she told the story of why the McNeils didn't have chickens anymore. Alphonse Desjardins wanted to hear the story about why he didn't have a boat anymore, or why he only had half a boat. He'd heard one story from his brother Charlie Peter, but he wanted to hear, as he called it, the real story.
Charlie Peter had a wild and woolly adventure when he roped a buffalo in the middle of the Slave River, and he'd been wishing he hadn't have done it ever since. Now, Granny told Alphonse that she hadn't been there to see what happened her own self, but she got the story firsthand from Jimmy Vermillion, that's Johnny Vermillion's oldest boy, who said he'd watched the whole thing with his binoculars from upstream on the tip of that island just below Hay Camp. Jimmy's story went something like this. What happened was, Jimmy had pulled into the island, tied his boat up, and ducked into a clump of willows on a matter of personal urgency. With his business done, Jimmy was back in his boat when he heard an outboard motor. He sat down in his boat, grabbed his binoculars, and scanned the river. And there was Charlie Peter Desjardins, motoring down the Slave River in his brother Alphonse's blue and white Chippewa skiff with that old-as-the-hills 18-horse Johnson outboard on it. Charlie Peter spied this black thing in the water. He thought it was a bear, so he swung around to check it out. But it wasn't a bear. It was a whole mountain of meat in the shape of a swimming buffalo out there in the middle of the river all by itself. Now, the Wood Buffalo National Park boundary goes right down the middle of the river on the map. But there's no line or fence or flags or floats or anything on the water, so it's some hard to tell where you're at for certain sure. One thing Charlie Peter knew was that he didn't want the parks people to take his brother's boat and motor away just because he shot a buffalo in the park. So what Charlie figured he'd do was, he'd throw a rope on the buffalo, put his kicker in reverse for a while, and circle around on the river until the buffalo got tired and just kind of stopped swimming. Sort of like a natural death, and he could say later that he just happened to be handy to save the meat from going to a terrible waste. Charlie Peter motored up real close, and he roped the buffalo's horns. He flipped his kicker into neutral, and he proceeded to crawl up to the front of the boat to tie the rope to the bow seat. Well, he did that, and he had some rope left over, so he decided to tie in the next seat too. And once he'd done that, he noticed with some alarm the motor had quit, and the buffalo had managed to swim dangerously close to the bank of the river. Charlie jumped to the back of the skiff to start the kicker. He yanked the starter rope and yanked it again. It wouldn't start. He tried choking it a tad. All right, then he flooded it. Again, he tried. Charlie Peter yanked on that starter rope and yanked some more, and the next thing you know, that old buffalo had found its footing and was heading for the hills. Charlie Peter executed a marvelous backflip over the transom of the skiff into the muddy brown waters of the Slave River. He disappeared completely under the water And when he finally surfaced and blinked the mud from his eyes, he was just in time to see the hind end of the blue and white skiff disappearing through the dark green willows up the riverbank. And of course, a few seconds after that, Charlie Peter's buffalo dived between a couple of birch trees that were only 3 feet apart. The boat was 4 feet wide, so that was all she wrote. Charlie's buffalo took off for the high country with the bow of the skiff, and Charlie was standing there with the water streaming down his face, his mouth wide open, and both feet stuck fast in the mud.